In the late summer of 1944, amid the hedgerows and shattered villages of Western Europe, the battle reached a moment of exhaustion. Smoke clung low to the ground. Rifles were hot to the touch. Somewhere between retreat and collapse, a lone German soldier emerged from the chaos with his hands raised. His uniform was torn, his face gray with dust and disbelief. For him, the war narrowed to a single instant, the moment when American infantrymen closed in, weapons trained, decisions already made. Capture came not with ceremony but with silence. A shout in English, a shove forward. The fighting moved on without him. To be taken prisoner in 1944 was to step into uncertainty. Stories circulated freely on both sides, of camps, of hunger, of illness, of men who vanished behind wire and never returned. The Geneva Conventions existed on paper, but faith in them was thin. For the captured soldier, survival now depended on forces beyond courage or training. He no longer advanced or retreated. He waited. Each mile marched under guard, each night spent on unfamiliar ground, reinforced a new reality. The war would continue without his consent. The irony was absolute and invisible. The young Americans who now held him at gunpoint, farm boys, clerks, students in borrowed uniforms, possessed power that no battlefield promotion could grant. They could feed him or deny him, protect him or look away. In that moment, they were enemies bound together by circumstance, unaware that this brief encounter would echo far beyond the war itself. None of them could imagine that decades later, names would be spoken again, not in anger but in recognition. Captivity stripped the soldier down to essentials. Hunger arrived first, then boredom, then reflection. Days blurred together behind wire fences and roll calls. The physical toll was measurable, weight lost, strength diminished, but the psychological weight pressed deeper. He replayed the moment of capture again and again, searching for meaning in survival. Was it chance, mercy, or simply the war's indifference? Around him, other prisoners asked the same questions in different languages. What he could not know was that this moment, the lowering of his rifle, the tightening of American hands around his arm, was not an ending. It was a beginning. Long after the uniforms were folded away and the war reduced to memory, this capture would resurface as the first chapter in a story about reconciliation, responsibility, and the quiet persistence of human connection. For now, though, the soldier marched forward with the column, eyes fixed ahead, unaware that far from the battlefield, time itself was already preparing a reckoning neither side could yet see. By doctrine and reputation, prisoner-of-war camps were places of endurance rather than comfort. Resources were limited by design. Rations were calculated, not generous. Daily life followed rigid schedules enforced by whistles, roll calls, and the geometry of fences that defined both space and possibility. For the German soldier now behind barbed wire, captivity confirmed what he had long believed. Survival would depend less on strength than on compliance. The war had not released him. It had simply changed its rules. The first nights were the hardest. Fear did not arrive loudly but steadily, settling in with the cold. Isolation followed close behind. Letters from home were rare and heavily censored. News of the front came in fragments, rumors whispered between bunks, guesses formed from the sound of distant artillery. He was surrounded by men, yet profoundly alone, suspended between a past he could no longer reach and a future that refused to take shape. Home felt impossibly far away, not only in distance but in time. There was an irony that revealed itself slowly. The same men who had defeated him now stood between him and death. American guards controlled food distribution, medical access, and discipline. A misstep could mean punishment. A small mercy could mean survival. An extra ladle of soup. A cigarette passed quietly through the wire. A guard who chose to look at a prisoner as a man rather than an enemy. These moments were minor by military standards, yet they carried enormous weight inside the camp. Adaptation became a daily discipline. The soldier learned when to speak and when to remain silent, how to conserve energy, how to hold morale together when time seemed endless. Songs were remembered, routines invented. Hope, though fragile, was guarded carefully. Obedience was not surrender, it was strategy. Each day survived was a victory measured in restraint rather than heroics. And within this controlled world, something unexpected took root. Respect surfaced in brief exchanges and shared understanding. Captor and captive remained divided by uniform and history, but not always by humanity. In these quiet intersections, the outlines of a future reconciliation began to form, unnoticed and unnamed. Years later, these memories would return with surprise. Sing clarity. But for now, behind the wire, the soldier watched the guards change shifts and wondered which of these faces might one day remember him, not as a prisoner, but as something else entirely. The encounter was unremarkable by military standards. An American officer, charged with the oversight of several hundred prisoners, paused during a routine inspection. His eyes settled briefly on one man among the rows, upright despite fatigue, attentive despite deprivation. The German soldier met his gaze without defiance. There was no gesture of challenge, only composure. In a war defined by exhaustion, that composure stood out. It suggested not surrender of character, but restraint. Doctrine left little room for interpretation. Prisoners were to be counted, fed, guarded, and moved as ordered. Distance was policy. Familiarity was discouraged. The officer understood this clearly. His responsibility was to maintain order, prevent escape, and ensure compliance with regulations that left little space for sentiment. Compassion, if it existed, was to remain invisible. The war demanded efficiency, not understanding. Yet hierarchy did not erase observation. Over time, the officer noticed small things: the prisoner's ability to organize others during work details, his quiet intervention when tensions rose, his refusal to exploit weakness for advantage. None of this altered the balance of power, but it complicated it. The enemy became an individual. The uniform began to conceal as much as it revealed. This created a private struggle. The officer was accountable to command, to regulations written far from the wire. But he was also accountable to his own judgment. Decisions about discipline, about labor assignments, about leniency carried moral weight even when they appeared routine. To treat prisoners with dignity was not required for victory. It was required for something else. The officer understood that how the war was fought would outlast the war itself. Between brief exchanges and silent acknowledgement, respect took shape without ceremony. There were no conversations about ideology, no confessions or apologies. Only an understanding that survival did not require humiliation. In this narrow space between authority and restraint, something enduring began to form. Neither man spoke of the future. Neither could imagine it clearly. But years later, when memory reached back across the divide of time, it would return to this place, this quiet relationship forged under obligation, where reconciliation first found its footing, unnoticed by history, yet impossible to erase. Armies are built on definitions. Uniforms declare allegiance. Training reduces complexity into obedience, drill, and command. From a distance, soldiers appear interchangeable, representatives of nations rather than individuals. This belief sustained the war. It allowed men to fight without pausing to consider who stood on the other side of the rifle. In the camps, however, distance collapsed. War became intimate, measured not in kilometers gained, but in daily encounters. The shock came quietly. A piece of bread shared when rations ran low. A brief conversation conducted in halting phrases, stripped of slogans and suspicion. The prisoner spoke of a town along a river. The officer mentioned a farm thousands of miles away. These exchanges were not confessions or reconciliations. They were acknowledgments, simple reminders that each man had existed before the war assigned him a role. In a place designed to erase individuality, such moments lingered. The irony was unmistakable. This was a conflict sustained by division, by language, ideology, and fear, yet the same human needs persisted on both sides of the wire. Hunger did not respect nationality. Fatigue did not recognize rank. Cold nights pressed equally against prisoner and guard. Intending to these needs, even briefly, the rigid boundaries of war softened, not disappeared, but bent. Both men felt the strain of balance. The officer understood his duty clearly. Leniency could be misread. Familiarity could invite disorder. Every decision carried consequence beyond intent. The prisoner, too, navigated risk. Trust was dangerous. Hope could be mistaken for weakness. Yet both recognized that cruelty was a choice, not a requirement. To act with restraint was to assert a form of control the war could not dictate. These moments did not alter the course of the conflict. Battles were still fought. Men still died. But within the narrow confines of captivity, a different truth emerged. Respect did not weaken authority. Empathy did not betray loyalty. They existed quietly, without ceremony, shaping memory more than policy. Long after the war ended, these fragments would endure. When time stripped away uniforms and replaced them with age, it would be these shared moments, brief, ordinary, human, that remained intact. And from them, a future meeting would draw its meaning, proving that even in war's darkest machinery, humanity would still be found waiting. As the war ground toward its conclusion, captivity became a test of endurance rather than event. The German prisoner moved through the remaining months under conditions that shifted with the front lines. Camps grew crowded as surrenders multiplied. Supply lines stretched thin. Work details lengthened. often under open skies and in different weather. There was no clear sense of duration, only the knowledge that survival required patience measured in days, not victories. It was widely understood among prisoners that survival depended on more than physical resilience. Skill mattered, knowing when to conserve strength, when to comply, when to speak, but oversight mattered more. The character of those in command shaped daily life. Fairness was not guaranteed, yet when it existed, it altered everything. A guard who enforced rules consistently. An officer who intervened when discipline drifted toward punishment. These distinctions decided whether captivity remained bearable or became lethal. Here, irony deepened. The officer responsible for order also became an unspoken guardian. His decisions, where to assign labor, how strictly to interpret regulations, when to overlook minor infractions, carried consequences that extended beyond paperwork. Humane judgment did not erase the imbalance of power, but it moderated it. The prisoner understood this clearly. His survival was tethered not only to his own restraint, but to the ethical limits imposed by another man. Both endured strain, though in different forms. The prisoner felt it in his body. Through fatigue, illness narrowly avoided the slow erosion of strength. The officer felt it in responsibility. Each decision demanded vigilance. To remain humane required effort. To resist indifference required resolve. War rewarded efficiency, not reflection. Yet reflection persisted, quietly shaping conduct when no one was watching. As the months passed, impressions hardened into memory. The prisoner noted consistency, restraint, and the absence of cruelty. The officer noted discipline, dignity, and resilience under pressure. These observations were never recorded, never acknowledged aloud, but they endured, preserved by circumstance rather than intention. When the war finally ended, it did not arrive with clarity. Liberation was uneven. Orders changed. Camps dissolved gradually. The prisoner stepped forward into an uncertain peace carrying more than survival. He carried a record of how he had been treated when he had no leverage at all. Years later, when the war had receded into history, these memories would resurface, not as grievances, but as testimony. They would form the foundation of recognition between former enemies. But for now, in the final days of conflict, both men moved forward separately, unaware that the judgments made in captivity were already shaping a future encounter neither could yet imagine. With the collapse of organized resistance in Europe, the machinery of captivity began to unwind. Orders shifted from containment to release. Names were checked, papers stamped, movements authorized. For prisoners of war, freedom arrived not as a single moment, but as a sequence of procedures that slowly returned agency. The belief was simple and universal. The war was over, and each man would now return to his own country to rebuild what had been broken. For the German soldier, departure came quietly. There was no ceremony, no exchange of words that might summarize the years just past. He gathered the few possessions he still owned and joined a column moving away from the camp. The American officer stood at a distance, overseeing the transfer with the same restraint that had defined their earlier encounters. The soldier did not know whether this was farewell or merely separation. War had trained men not to expect closure. The irony endured. These two men, once bound by hierarchy and circumstance, now walked away from one another as civilians in waiting. Yet what connected them could not be undone by distance or time. Shared history had formed an invisible thread, woven from restraint, judgment, and moments of quiet recognition. They were no longer enemies, but neither were they friends. They were witnesses to each other's conduct when choice was limited and character was exposed. Both returned to lives altered by experience. The soldier went home to a defeated nation, carrying memories of captivity that resisted simplification. Survival brought relief, but also reflection. He remembered not only hardship, but fairness. Not only fear, but dignity preserved. The officer returned to a country marked by victory and exhaustion. He resumed civilian life with decisions unrecorded, choices unnoticed by history, yet heavy with consequence. He understood that the war had tested more than strategy. It had tested restraint. Years passed, the world reorganized itself. New conflicts emerged. Old ones settled into textbooks and commemorations, yet the impressions formed during those months behind wire remained intact. Neither man spoke often of them. Memory did not require repetition to endure. What neither could foresee was that time would not dissolve their connection. It would clarify it. Decades later, paths thought permanently divided would converge again, drawn together by the unfinished meaning of those early encounters. The war had separated them. Peace, slowly and unexpectedly, would offer something else entirely. For now, though, they moved in opposite directions, each carrying forward a private account of how the war had been fought when no one was watching, and how those choices would one day ask to be remembered. The decades that followed the war unfolded without spectacle. The German soldier returned to a country rebuilding itself from ruins, cities reduced to foundations, identities stripped and reassembled with care. He found work, formed a family, and learned to live within a peace shaped by loss and restraint. The American officer followed a different path, returning to a nation marked by victory yet uneasy with its cost. He, too, built a life measured in ordinary milestones, career, responsibility, the steady passage of years. The war receded, but it did not disappear. It remained present, quiet, and formative. What neither man anticipated was how a brief wartime relationship would persist beneath the surface of daily life. It did not dictate choices, but it influenced them. The soldier carried with him an enduring awareness of how power could be exercised without cruelty. It shaped how he judged authority, how he treated others when he himself held responsibility. The officer retained a similar imprint. His experience overseeing prisoners sharpened his sense of ethical limits. He understood that rules alone did not define conduct, judgment did. Time applied pressure in subtle ways. Memories softened at the edges, but certain details remained precise. The sound of boots on gravel during roll call, the tone of a voice issuing orders without contempt, the recognition that dignity could survive even under confinement. These recollections surfaced unexpectedly, during quiet moments, during conversations with children and grandchildren who asked about the war as history rather than experience. Life, meanwhile, demanded attention. Careers advanced. Families grew. Loss arrived in familiar forms unrelated to combat. The world changed. Borders shifted. Former enemies became allies. Yet the internal reckoning of wartime experience did not age at the same pace. It resisted simplification. Neither man spoke often of captivity or command, but both measured later events against those early moral tests. The war had taught them that character was revealed not in triumph, but in restraint. The irony endured across generations. A relationship forged under coercion, one man armed, the other confined, had become a quiet reference point for integrity. It had shaped their understanding of responsibility long after uniforms were discarded. What began as duty had evolved into memory. What memory preserved was not suffering alone, but conduct. As years turned into decades, the possibility of reunion seemed increasingly remote. The world was vast, time was indifferent, yet memory proved more durable than expectation. Each man retained a sense that the past remained unfinished, not in grievance but in meaning. There was no urgency, only awareness. The war had placed them briefly in each other's care. History had moved on, but memory had not. By the early 21st century, both men had reached an age where reflection became less optional. The future narrowed, the past expanded, names resurfaced, questions lingered. What had that moment meant? What had survived it? The passage of time had not erased the connection, it had clarified it. Neither man knew precisely how or when their paths might converge again. But across 60 years of separate lives, one truth endured. Shared history does not fade simply because it is quiet. It waits. And in waiting, it gathers weight, until one day, unexpectedly, it asks to be acknowledged. The shock arrived without warning, carried not by memory but by circumstance. A name resurfaced where none was expected, on a veterans list in an archival inquiry, through a mutual contact tracing fragments of a long, quiet war. After decades of separation, each man became aware that the other was still alive. The past, carefully contained for years, shifted suddenly into the present. What had been memory alone now carried the possibility of response. The prevailing belief was that such connections belonged to another era. Wars ended. Lives moved on. Former enemies did not reappear after 60 years to reopen chapters presumed closed. Time, it was assumed, erased relevance. Yet relevance returned all the same. The distance between captor and captive, once measured in yards of wire, now spanned continents and generations, but it narrowed with surprising speed. Ani shaped the moment. Tools unimaginable in 1945, databases, letters forwarded across borders, messages sent with uncertain expectation, created an opening the war never could. A single inquiry became a line drawn across decades. What chance had failed to deliver on the battlefield, time and technology now permitted? The war had separated them. Peace, improbably, had reintroduced them. The struggle was internal before it was mutual. Each man hesitated. To respond was to disturb a carefully ordered past. Memories long dormant stirred with clarity, faces, voices, moments weighted with consequence. There was uncertainty in how to speak across such distance. What language could bridge authority and captivity, youth and age, war and peace? Silence seemed safer, yet silence had already lasted long enough. When the first words were exchanged, they were measured and restrained. No accusations, no apologies demanded, only acknowledgement. Each man recognized the other not as an adversary, but as a participant in a shared moment neither had fully understood at the time. The correspondence did not attempt to reinterpret history, it simply affirmed it. Emotion surfaced gradually, carried by precision rather than sentiment. The prisoner recalled fairness when none was required. The officer recalled restraint when indifference would have been easier. These recollections were not rehearsed narratives. They were details, small, exact, resistant to exaggeration. In revisiting them, both men confronted the weight of choices made when outcomes were uncertain and oversight imperfect. What emerged was not reconciliation in the dramatic sense, but recognition. Each saw reflected in the other a version of himself shaped by restraint under pressure. The war had placed them in opposition. Time had revealed what endured beneath that opposition. The correspondence did not erase suffering or imbalance. It clarified responsibility. Letters accumulated, exchanges deepened. The past no longer pressed in isolation. It had context. What once existed only in memory now found confirmation. The invisible thread drawn decades earlier proved real and unbroken. The revelation was quiet but decisive. Human connection, formed under extraordinary constraint, had not dissolved with time. It had waited. Across 60 years of separate lives, it had endured unnoticed, preserved not by intention but by conduct. The war had tested them briefly. The peace now tested something else, the courage to acknowledge what had survived it. As the correspondence continued, a new question emerged, one neither man had anticipated asking. Memory had found its voice. The past had reached forward, and with that, the possibility of meeting, once unthinkable, began to take shape, waiting just beyond the written word. Once the possibility of meeting had been acknowledged, it could not be easily set aside. Practical considerations followed, dates proposed, letters exchanged, arrangements negotiated across distance and age. Each detail carried weight beyond logistics. This was not travel in the ordinary sense. It was a return to an unfinished moment, approached with care and hesitation. Both men understood that anticipation could be heavier than memory. Anxiety accompanied preparation. The German veteran wondered how he would be seen, not as he had been, but as he now was. Time had altered his body, softened his voice, and sharpened his recollections. The American officer confronted similar uncertainty. Authority, once clear, had dissolved into age and reflection. Rank no longer separated them. What remained was vulnerability. The war had once dictated their roles. Peace now offered no script. The irony was unmistakable. In youth, both had been trained to suppress hesitation, to act decisively under fire, to accept risk without pause. Now, decades later, they faced a different trial. There were no orders to follow, no doctrine to consult. To meet required a form of courage unfamiliar to wartime experience. It demanded openness rather than resolve, acknowledgement rather than control. Memories intensified as the date approached. Each man revisited the past with new attention, testing recollections against the possibility of confirmation. Details once private gained significance. What had seemed ordinary in captivity now appeared consequential. Choices made under constraint returned for examination, not in judgment, but in understanding. The meeting promised neither absolution nor celebration. It promised truth. There was also the question of what the reunion would become. Would it remain formal, confined to polite acknowledgement and restraint? Or would it reach further into territory shaped by mutual respect and shared reflection? The uncertainty itself carried risk. To hope was to expose oneself. Yet both men recognized that avoidance would render the correspondence incomplete. Words had carried them far. Presence would decide what remained unresolved. As arrangements solidified, war receded once more into background. The meeting was no longer about nations or outcomes. It was about conduct remembered and character recognized. The men who approached one another were not representatives of armies. They were witnesses to each other and to the quiet moral terrain navigated long ago. What emerged in this approach was a shared recognition. Reconciliation is not passive. It requires effort, patience, and the willingness to confront discomfort. The war had demanded obedience. This demanded agency. Each man chose to proceed not because history required it, but because memory invited it. In preparing to meet, both understood that friendship was not guaranteed. Respect, however, already existed. It had been formed under conditions that discouraged it and preserved through decades of silence. The reunion offered a chance to give that respect shape, to transform an implicit understanding into something visible. As the journey neared, anticipation settled into resolve. The meeting would not rewrite the past. It would not redeem the war, but it might clarify what had endured beyond it. Two men, once bound by captivity and command, now moved toward one another without rank or weapon, guided only by the belief that acknowledging shared history was an act worth completing. And somewhere between departure and arrival, the war finally loosened its grip, making room for an encounter shaped not by conflict, but by choice. The meeting took place without spectacle. No uniforms, no ranks. Two elderly men stood facing one another in a quiet room, their movements careful, their expressions measured. 60 years had passed since they last occupied the same space. Time had altered their posture and softened their voices, but recognition arrived immediately. The shock was not in seeing a former enemy, but in realizing how much of that earlier moment had endured. The war, once all-consuming, now stood at a distance, present but no longer in command. They spoke first of ordinary things, families, careers, the long arc of years that had carried them from youth into age. Yet beneath these exchanges ran a current of shared memory that required no explanation. Each understood that the other had lived a full life shaped in part by the brief intersection of their own. The belief settled quickly. Time had not erased what had been formed during captivity. It had preserved it. The irony revealed itself gradually. In 1944, one had held authority, the other submission. One issued orders, the other complied. Now they met as equals, neither defined by command nor confinement. The war had stripped them of symmetry. Peace restored it. They spoke not as representatives of nations, but as men who had survived the moral weight of decisions made under pressure. Their stories differed in detail, but not in gravity. As conversation deepened, the past emerged with clarity. They spoke of the camp without embellishment, of routines, of restraint, of moments when choices mattered more than outcomes. The prisoner recalled fairness when fear was constant. The officer recalled the effort required to remain humane when indifference would have been easier. These were not rehearsed recollections. They were precise, unadorned, and shared without accusation. This exchange marked a turning point. What had existed for decades as parallel memory now became shared testimony. Each man heard his own past reflected back through the other's experience. The respect once implied was now articulated. It did not elevate either man. It clarified them. The reunion confirmed what correspondence had suggested, that their wartime relationship had been defined not by hostility, but by restraint exercised under extraordinary conditions. There was no attempt to dramatize reconciliation, no declarations, no symbolic gestures. The weight of the moment lay in its simplicity. They sat together, acknowledging that survival had not been guaranteed and dignity had not been required, yet both had been preserved. The war had tested them differently, but it had tested them simultaneously. That shared trial had bound them more tightly than either had understood at the time. Perspective, gained through distance, allowed for honesty without bitterness. They did not speak of forgiveness because neither felt wronged in the ways history often records. Instead, they spoke of responsibility, of how small decisions accumulate, of how conduct once observed is never forgotten. The passage of time had revealed that the true measure of those years lay not in captivity or command, but in character maintained when oversight was minimal. As the meeting drew on, the war receded further. What remained was connection, quiet, unforced, and durable. The reunion did not change the past. It illuminated it. Acts of humanity once carried out without expectation now revealed their resonance. What had seemed incidental had proven enduring. When they finally parted, it was without ceremony, no closing. Statements were needed. The meaning of the encounter had already settled between them. 60 years earlier, they had been brought together by war. Now, they separated by choice, each carrying forward a shared understanding that transcended victory and defeat. The war had ended long ago, but in this meeting, its final echo was resolved, not with absolution or judgment, but with recognition. And in that recognition lay a truth history often overlooks, that moments of restraint, exercised quietly, can outlast the violence that made them necessary. With the formality of reunion behind them, conversation turned inward. The war, once a distant backdrop to polite exchange, became the subject itself. Both men spoke carefully, not from hesitation, but from respect for what memory carried. They recalled fear without embellishment, the kind that settled quietly before sleep and returned uninvited years later. They spoke of uncertainty, of decisions made with incomplete knowledge, of moments when the margin between harm and restraint narrowed to a single choice. The German veteran described captivity not as a single experience, but as a sequence of tests. Fear at capture, uncertainty behind wire, the slow realization that survival depended as much on the character of others as on his own endurance. He spoke without accusation, acknowledging the imbalance of power while naming the restraint that had shaped his memory. What remained vivid was not deprivation alone, but the absence of cruelty when it would have gone unnoticed. The American officer listened, then spoke in turn. He described responsibility as a burden rarely understood by those who never carried it. Oversight of prisoners demanded vigilance, not only against disorder, but against indifference. He recalled the ease with which routine could become neglect, and how effort was required to remain humane when no reward followed. These were not confessions. They were acknowledgments of the moral terrain navigated quietly without witnesses. The irony was unavoidable. The man once confined now listened freely. The man once commanding now spoke without authority. Their roles had reversed in form, but not in meaning. Memory had equalized them. In sharing their accounts, they discovered not contradiction, but convergence. Each had faced the same question from opposite sides of the wire: how to act when power was uneven and consequences uncertain. This exchange marked a turning point in their understanding of the past. Dialogue did not soften history, it clarified it. The war, long reduced to dates and outcomes, regained its human dimension. They spoke not of strategy or victory, but of restraint exercised under pressure, of fear resisted, of dignity preserved when it could have been denied. These were not lessons taught by doctrine. They were learned through proximity to consequence. As the conversation deepened, former enmity receded entirely. What replaced it was recognition of shared vulnerability and shared responsibility. The war had demanded obedience, but it had also revealed choice. Both men recognized that moral courage rarely announces itself. It appears in quiet refusals, in measured responses, in the decision to see another person rather than a category. Reconciliation, they realized, was not an event. It was a process already underway long before correspondence or reunion. It had begun in captivity, continued in memory, and matured through reflection. Time had not diminished its meaning. It had allowed perspective to develop without urgency or defensiveness. The past no longer pressed for resolution. It invited understanding. They did not claim that such outcomes were common. War, they acknowledged, more often produced bitterness than reconciliation. But their experience demonstrated what remained possible. That conduct, once observed, carries forward. That restraint, once exercised, leaves a trace. That humanity, when preserved under constraint, does not vanish when the constraint is removed. As the conversation drew to a close, neither man attempted to summarize what had been said. The meaning did not require conclusion. It had revealed itself gradually through careful language and attentive silence. The war had shaped them both, but it had not defined them entirely. In their shared reflection lay a final revelation. That moral courage is not confined to moments of heroism. It endures in memory, influences a lifetime, and when acknowledged, bridges even the deepest divisions. The conflict that once separated them had ended decades earlier. What remained, quiet, deliberate, and intact, was proof that humanity, once chosen, can outlast war itself. The reunion revealed something neither man had fully anticipated. What lingered most strongly was not the memory of fear or deprivation, but the enduring impact of restraint and empathy exercised under pressure. The shock lay in recognizing how small decisions, made without expectation of acknowledgement, had shaped lives across decades. What had once seemed incidental, fairness shown, dignity preserved, had proven permanent. In the presence of one another, the scale of that realization became clear. The war had been vast, impersonal, and destructive. Their relationship had been narrow, quiet, and human, yet it was the latter that endured with clarity. Empathy, once offered within the limits of duty, had crossed time intact. It had survived defeat, victory, and the long silence that followed. The irony was unmistakable. Men who once stood on opposite sides of a global conflict now spoke with ease and mutual regard. They did not deny the reality of war or the suffering it caused. Instead, they embodied something less expected. That respect could emerge without agreement, and gratitude could exist without absolution. Friendship in this context was not sentimental. It was earned through conduct remembered and confirmed. As their story became known to others, family members, historians, listeners. It took on new meaning. It was no longer simply personal. It became a living testament to reconciliation, grounded not in ideology but in experience. Their bond demonstrated that the human spirit, when exercised with restraint, leaves traces that history cannot easily erase. This was not an argument against remembering war's brutality. It was a reminder that brutality does not exhaust the record of what occurs within it. The turning point came as both men recognized that their experience carried responsibility. Memory, once private, now served a wider purpose. By speaking openly, they offered evidence that moral courage does not depend on dramatic resistance or heroic defiance. It resides in quieter acts, choosing fairness when power allows otherwise, choosing recognition when dehumanization is easier. Their conversations returned often to that theme. War tests systems and strategies, but it tests individuals more intimately. The decisions made in those moments, unrecorded, uncelebrated, shape how the war is ultimately remembered by those who lived it. In acknowledging this, both men understood that their bond was not accidental. It was the result of choices aligned, however briefly, with conscience. The revelation extended beyond their own lives. Actions taken decades earlier had influenced families, perspectives, and values passed down across generations. Compassion exercised under constraint had become instruction by example. It demonstrated that morality is not suspended by conflict. It is challenged by it, and when upheld, it carries forward. Their bond did not negate the suffering of others or simplify the war's legacy. It stood alongside those realities, offering contrast rather than correction. It reminded listeners that even within systems built for destruction, individuals retain agency. What they do with it matters, sometimes in ways revealed only much later. As time narrowed further, urgency gave way to clarity. The men did not seek to memorialize themselves. They sought understanding. What endured between them was not nostalgia, but affirmation that humanity, once chosen, does not expire with circumstance. It waits. It accumulates meaning, and when finally recognized, it speaks with quiet authority. In the end, their story did not belong solely to them. It belonged to the broader record of war and peace. It illustrated that compassion, exercised without audience, can outlast the violence that made it difficult. The bond formed beyond battle did not erase history. It completed a part of it. And in that completion lay the final truth. Wars end when the fighting stops, but their meaning is decided later, by what is remembered, by what is acknowledged, and by whether humanity is allowed to endure. The consequences of their reunion extended beyond personal closure. It invited reflection, quiet, deliberate, on what war demands of those caught within it. Their story did not rewrite history, but it reframed a portion of it. Ethics, once tested under constraint, emerged as enduring reference points. The war had forced decisions measured in seconds. The meaning of those decisions unfolded across a lifetime. What struck observers most was the simplicity of the choices remembered. No act described was extraordinary by military definition. There were no medals earned in captivity, no citations issued for restraint. Yet the cumulative effect of these decisions proved profound. Empathy exercised without expectation had shaped survival, memory, and understanding long after the guns fell silent. Moral courage, it became clear, often operates without witnesses. The irony was unmistakable. A conflict designed to divide the world into enemies and allies had produced a bond rooted in respect. What began as domination and submission evolved into recognition and gratitude. This transformation did not deny the brutality of war. It stood in contrast to it. Unity emerged not from shared ideology, but from shared conduct under pressure. As their story reached others, it resonated across generations. Families heard it not as a tale of reconciliation alone, but as a lesson in agency. History often emphasizes structures, orders, strategies, outcomes. Their experience emphasized choice. It reminded listeners that even within rigid systems, individuals retain the capacity to act with conscience. That capacity, once exercised, leaves an imprint. The revelation lay in scale. One decision, to enforce rules fairly, to resist cruelty, to acknowledge another person's dignity, had echoed through decades. It had influenced how lives were lived, how authority was viewed, how memory was carried. The war provided the context. Humanity provided the direction. The echo was not loud, but it was persistent. This legacy challenged assumptions about moral behavior in conflict. It suggested that ethics are not suspended by war, but tested by it. That restraint is not weakness, but resolve. That compassion does not undermine duty but defines it. These truths were not argued. They were demonstrated quietly through lived experience. In reflecting on their story, both men recognized that legacy is not something claimed. It is something revealed over time. What endured between them was not sentiment but integrity. The reunion did not create meaning. It uncovered it. The meaning had been present since the moment one man chose to see another not solely as an enemy, but as a human being. As the years narrowed and memory took on greater urgency, this understanding sharpened. The past could not be altered, but its interpretation could mature. Their experience offered a counterpoint to narratives of inevitability. It affirmed that even in systems designed to suppress individuality, personal agency remains. The legacy of humanity they embodied did not belong to a single moment or meeting. It belonged to the long arc of time that revealed consequence. Actions once taken in obscurity now stood illuminated, not as exceptions, but as possibilities. In the end, their story left a simple, enduring conclusion. Wars are fought by nations, but remembered by people. And within that memory, it is not the violence alone that persists, but the moments when violence was restrained. One decision, made quietly, can outlast the conflict that demanded it. That is the legacy of humanity, measured not in victory or defeat, but in conduct that endures when everything else has passed. History often reserves its language of heroism for moments of fire and movement, charges taken, positions held, lives lost in visible ways. Yet beyond the battlefield's noise exists another register of courage, quieter and less recorded. The two men at the center of this story came to exemplify it without intent or recognition. Their actions did not alter campaigns or shorten the war. They altered something more enduring, how power was exercised and how memory would later judge it. The human element of their experience resists simplification. Neither man considered himself exceptional. One followed orders under the constraints of captivity. The other enforced them under the burden of authority. Yet within those limits, both chose restraint. They listened when indifference would have sufficed. They acted with fairness when excess went unchallenged. These decisions were small in appearance and profound in effect. They required no audience. They depended only on conscience. The irony is that such bravery often goes unnoticed precisely because it avoids spectacle. Combat rewards decisiveness and force. Reconciliation requires patience and vulnerability. In the aftermath of war, it is easier to preserve distance than to revisit shared history. It is easier to remember roles than to acknowledge individuals. True bravery in this sense lies not only in facing an enemy, but in facing memory, honestly without defense. When the men later reconnected, their bond did not emerge from shared ideology or victory. It emerged from recognition. Each saw in the other a reflection of restraint exercised under pressure. This recognition did not erase imbalance or suffering. It placed them in context. It allowed both men to understand that dignity preserved under constraint carries moral weight long after authority dissolves. Their story challenges assumptions about reconciliation. Forgiveness here was not declared. It was implicit in conduct remembered and confirmed. The bond that formed did not depend on forgetting the past, but on understanding it accurately. War had defined their roles. Peace allowed them to examine the choices made within those roles. That examination required courage of a different kind, the courage to acknowledge complexity without retreating into certainty. As their account reached others, it offered a counter-narrative to familiar histories. It suggested that reconciliation is not an abstract ideal reserved for treaties and ceremonies. It is a practice, enacted by individuals long before institutions recognize it. The aftermath of war is often described in terms of reconstruction and alliances. Less often is it described in terms of moral repair. Their bond illuminated that quieter process. The revelation lay in continuity. The humanity shown during captivity did not end with release. It persisted through decades of silence, shaped lives, and resurfaced when conditions allowed acknowledgement. This endurance speaks to the potential embedded in individual action. What is done once with integrity does not remain confined to its moment. It becomes part of a longer moral record. These men did not seek to be remembered as symbols, yet in their ordinariness lies their significance. They remind us that history is not only the accumulation of decisive acts, but of restrained ones. That reconciliation is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of effort. That humanity, when preserved under the most difficult conditions, becomes a form of quiet leadership. Their bond stands as evidence that the aftermath of war is not predetermined. Even when violence defines the context, individuals retain the capacity to choose differently. That choice may not stop a war, but it can shape what remains when the war is over. In recognizing these unsung heroes of reconciliation, the record expands. Courage is no longer measured solely by proximity to danger, but by proximity to responsibility. Bravery is found not only in advancing under fire, but in reaching back across time to acknowledge another human being. And in that reaching, history gains something rare. Proof that even after profound division, the potential for humanity endures, quietly, persistently, waiting to be recognized. 60 years had separated them. Years shaped by distance, silence, and lives lived independently of one another. Yet when they stood together at the end of that long passage, separation no longer defined the story. What endured was something quieter and more difficult to measure: courage exercised without recognition, empathy sustained without expectation, and respect formed under circumstances that discouraged it. The war had brought them together by force. Humanity had kept them connected by choice. In reflecting on their reunion, both men understood that what they shared was not sentiment but clarity. The past had not softened with time. It had sharpened. Captivity was still captivity. Authority was still authority. Yet the meaning of those roles had evolved. They no longer spoke as adversaries bound by history's verdicts, but as individuals who had faced the same moral question from opposite sides: how to act when power was unequal and consequence unavoidable. The reunion did not revise the war. It did not suggest equivalence where none existed, nor did it erase suffering endured elsewhere. Instead, it illuminated a narrow corridor within the conflict, one where restraint mattered and choice remained possible. Their story demonstrated that humanity is not suspended by war. It is tested by it, and when upheld, it leaves traces that time cannot remove. What made their bond enduring was not agreement, but recognition. Each man saw in the other a reflection of conduct remembered clearly and judged fairly. The German soldier recognized that survival had been shaped not only by endurance, but by the ethical limits imposed by another. The American officer recognized that authority had meaning only insofar as it was restrained. These recognitions did not require forgiveness as declaration. They existed as understanding. The reflection extended beyond their own lives. Their story offered a counterweight to narratives that reduce war to inevitability. It affirmed that individual action matters even within vast systems of violence. That dignity, once preserved, becomes memory. And memory, when acknowledged, becomes legacy. What they carried forward was not pride, but responsibility. The responsibility to speak honestly about what had endured when hatred had every advantage. In the final measure, their reunion proved something both simple and difficult to accept. Humanity is not defined by circumstance, but by response. War creates conditions that reward cruelty and indifference. To resist those impulses requires courage of a particular kind, the kind that does not announce itself and may never be rewarded. Yet it is precisely this courage that lasts. Their respect did not end with the meeting. It became correspondence, conversation, and mutual regard carried into the final years of life. The bond was not loud or performative. It did not seek validation. It existed because it had been earned, first in captivity, then in memory, and finally in acknowledgement. Lifelong respect, they discovered, does not require lifelong proximity. It requires integrity sustained across time. As the story closes, what remains is not a lesson imposed, but an example offered. From captor and captive to friends, their journey reminds us that the past is not fixed solely by what happens, but by how it is remembered and understood. The war ended when the fighting stopped. Its meaning, however, continued to evolve, shaped by the quiet decisions made when no one was watching. 60 years separated them, but courage, empathy, and respect brought them together at last. From captor and captive to friends, their story shows that the past can heal when courage and compassion prevail.